Okay, before we kick off, I've got a few housekeeping points to run through. You're all automatically muted and your videos are off. During the panel sessions, please enter your questions using the Q&A function. Due to a large number of attendees, we kindly ask that you ask your questions throughout the event rather than at the start of the Q&A. I'd like to let you know that we are recording this session and we'll distribute the recording afterwards. We will also be after your feedback, so please keep an eye out for a post-event survey in your inboxes. We'll be linking to the event survey, post-event survey at the end of this presentation as well. We've enabled closed captioning for those who wish to use it during the event. To access the closed captions, please select the captions icon in the toolbar below. So welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about a couple of trials that we've used, where we've used randomized controlled trials to test the efficacy of interventions prompted by learner analytics to support student success. Before I forget, there's a learner analytics poll here, and if you are able to, please respond. If you work at a higher education institution, would be very interested to hear about your experiences of learner analytics. I'll leave that up for a second longer. Okay, so a large number of people seem to have no learner analytics system, but they're planning to run one. And then we've got a sort of a fair proportion of people who use it for monitoring purposes and a reasonable proportion of people who are using it to send out alerts. Okay, I'm going to end the poll there and get cracking with the rest of the presentation. Okay, so a quick outline of the session. We'll give a background to why we started these trials, a description of them and the impact analysis. We've also got an implementation and process evaluation as part of the impact analysis, and we'll be running through some of the qualitative data that we got from the students who experienced the interventions at the two sites. And finally, we'll have a panel discussion and some audience Q&A. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists, Ed Foster and Helen Parkin from Nottingham Trent and Sheffield Hallam, respectively, and they will be joining us for the panel later. So TASO's remit is to support what works for access, success, and progression out of university. A lot of our work has been involved in the access side of things, at least up to the point that we started running this project, but this is a project where we wanted to look at student success. And learner analytics is something that's identified a few years ago as a means of enabling the support of student success. And there's certainly strong evidence out there that learner analytics systems are good at identifying students as struggling, but the evidence is weaker for their use in supporting struggling students. And where the evidence exists, there are a couple of randomized controlled trials in the US. As I say, they're in the US and not the UK, and we know there are contextual differences between the US and the UK that might mean that things that work over there don't work here and vice versa. So we felt it was important to run some randomized controlled trials of learner analytics prompted interventions. So learner analytics systems, they collate student data when students interact with university systems or attend lectures. So when students log in to their virtual learning environment, when they attend lectures and check in there, maybe when they make an online submission or check out library books, they create a digital footprint, and learner analytics systems collate all that data and sometimes also integrate it with prior attainment data and demographic data, although that's slightly less common. And the two, Nottingham Trent University and Sheffield Hallam University, the two providers who were involved in this trial, neither of them used the prior attainment or demographic data in their analytics systems. They use them primarily based on behavioural data. And then what the Learner Analytics system can do, either it can just be a fairly passive system and maybe display a dashboard for students to access, or maybe only staff. But more active systems, like the ones that we're going to be describing here, they will analyse the analytics data, and if based on whatever thresholds of feedback or algorithm that's been decided, low engaging or no engaging students will be flagged, and maybe for an intervention. Maybe it's an email alert, sort of asking what's going on, or a support phone call to give them help or whatever. Maybe a meeting with their tutor. So the trials here were testing two different interventions, an email-only intervention and an email plus phone call intervention. And as I said before, we had two higher education providers, one NTU, who are established use of learner analytics-based interventions, and Sheffield Hallam, who were at the time were exploring the use of learner analytics-based interventions. This was a rapid randomised control trial run in the autumn of 2022. During the first term of the autumn 2022 term, in Nottingham Trent, the monitoring takes place over the full 12 weeks of term, and interventions can occur from week 3 onwards. At Sheffield Hallam, they do it slightly differently. Monitoring occurs between week 2 and week 8, and then some checking of the data occurs in week 4 and week 7, and then the interventions occur the week after that. So they only occur at 2 points, whereas at Nottingham Trent, the interventions can occur all the way through the term. And there are some differences in the kind of data that leads to a flagging of whether a student gets an intervention or not. So NTU use a combination of 7 different data streams. And if all of those are 0 for 10 days, if you're a first-year student, or 14 days for other students, then that student will be flagged as requiring some form of intervention. At Sheffield, it's slightly different. They use only 2 streams, attendance and logins to their virtual learning environment. And if either one or the other of those are 0 for 14 days, so there's no attendance or there are no logins for 14 days, then that student will be flagged as needing support. Whereas at Nottingham, it's a pure no engagement intervention. At Sheffield, students who are engaging could also, but only slightly, or only in one case or the other, will be flagged for an intervention. The interventions at each institution are broadly similar, but there are some subtle differences. So we're comparing an email plus phone plus automatic phone call intervention with an email only intervention. At Sheffield, the students who were flagged for the email and phone intervention also received a text message to inform them that they were going to receive a phone call. And for the email-only intervention, Nottingham Trent allowed their students to book a support phone call if they needed through that email. In each case, the email signposted students to support as well. So the trial was conducted in the following ways. We had our full sample of students to be randomised. For NTU, it was their full undergraduate population. For Sheffield Hallam, it was just a subset of the courses as they were rolling out their learner analytics-based interventions. The full set of students were randomised to either receive an email and phone call intervention or an email-only intervention if they generated an alert. And then those students who did generate an at-risk alert, and so at Nottingham Trent it was 2,207, and Sheffield Hallam it was 514. They then became part of our analysis sample, and they received either one intervention or another, depending on the randomisation that had occurred. And approximately half in each, half of the total in each intervention. The main outcomes of the trial were engagement rating, and there were 2 levels of that, a short-term and a medium-term engagement rating, and an additional at-risk flag, whether students generated an additional at-risk flag in term 1. At Nottingham Trent, the engagement ratings lie between 1 and 5, where 1 is low engagement and 5 is high engagement, and it's some weighted averaging of their 7 data streams. So all the results that I'm going to present today are presented on a graph like this. There'll be two horizontal bars shown shortly. The top one will be for the email only intervention. The bottom one will be for the email and phone call intervention. In this case, low engagement at 1 on the left and high engagement 5 on the right. And so for Nottingham Trent short-term engagement rating, which is 10 days post the intervention being issued, we find that there is no difference between the engagement rating for the email-only students versus the ones who received an email and a default phone call. So our first main outcome, the short-term engagement rating, we're finding no effect. When we look to the medium-term engagement rating, although which was done in over the first 4 weeks of the term after, so the second term, although we find engagement overall is higher, again, there is no difference between the two interventions in terms of their engagement rating. So our medium-term engagement rating, again, no difference. There's no difference in outcomes. Now, Sheffield Hallam measured their engagement in a slightly different way. They use traffic light system for virtual engagement and physical engagement for each of the students' modules. So a student per term will have between 10 and 12 traffic light indicators on any given day, depending on the number of modules they're taking. And their engagement is calculated based on the proportion of red traffic light indicators and red indicating low engagement. So for these graphs, high engagement is at the left-hand side because that's the proportion of red traffic light indicators. So if it's 0, then it's high engagement. And again, we're finding that engagement is pretty much the same for whether students received an email only or an email and a phone call. And and that was at week 9, so that's their short-term, what we're calling our short-term engagement. So it was after the second round of interventions. And then we looked a few weeks after that and found again engagement was similar between the two types of intervention. Okay, our next main outcome were looking at additional at-risk flags generated by students. So a similar graph to the engagement ones, but now on the x-axis, the percentage of students who generated another at-risk flag. Now at NTU, we find that those who received a phone call did generate fewer at-risk flags than those who received an email only, but it wasn't a significant difference. And then at Sheffield, there was a similar finding that those who received a phone call also generated fewer additional at-risk flags, but again, the finding wasn't significant. So all our main outcomes, we're finding no effect of the whether students received an email or a phone call. We also, because students at Nottingham Trent who received an email intervention could also book a call, we looked at what happens to those students who do book a call. And while we find that students who booked a call were more likely to answer the call, so 62% of students who booked a call answered the phone, as opposed to 40% of students who answered the automatic phone call, far more calls are answered overall by students who are automatically called, because only 50 students booked a call. So if you want to get in touch with students, it's a default call. You don't want to give them the option only of booking. You want to call them. There are a couple of other exploratory outcomes, which I'll just very briefly go over here. We looked at post-intervention attendance at Nottingham. And again, there was no difference in post-intervention attendance. And at Sheffield, we also looked at the percentage of students who withdrew in term 1. And again, there was no difference. And because there are a very small number of students who did withdraw, we can't have a huge amount of confidence in those findings at the moment. Now, that's the impact analysis. That tells us that at the moment, we can't find any difference between a phone call intervention and an email intervention, but it doesn't tell us why that might be the case. And it doesn't tell us the effects of the phone call on the students who did answer the call, and also the effects of the email intervention on those who received it and didn't receive a phone call. Both providers conducted an implementation and process evaluation, which between them included 19 interviews with students. They also interviewed staff, and these were students who were both in the email only group and the email plus phone group. And both institutions conducted a thematic analysis on their interviews with the students and staff. In the theory of change, several dimensions came up as plausible outcomes, including sense of belonging and self-efficacy, and making contact with the students in this way would increase those. And that certainly came out, as you can see from the quotes here, with interviews from the students. And it appears that they really that it was more than just a sense of belonging, it was a sense of mattering, that it was that the phone call really did help them feel as though they belonged to the institution and they mattered to the institution as well. There's also some evidence from there was that the signposting was also working, but whether that was signposting due to the email only or the phone call as well, we're not sure. Particularly as a couple of the students said that the email was a sufficient wake-up call to get back into action. But students definitely valued the phone call, and that was a view shared by the staff who made the phone calls, and they felt that they had quality conversations with these students, and it really showed the personal touch. So in summary, across two providers and in comparison with a support email alone, we couldn't find an additional effect of a phone call on either engagement ratings or the likelihood of additional at-risk flags being generated. But students who were interviewed welcomed the intervention. So what's going on? Well, part of it is that we don't, that the duration of the trial was quite short. So we only have relatively short-term engagement, short-term measures. We don't have attainment and withdrawal from sort of a longer term. And also we don't have really any feedback from the students who don't engage with the interventions. And of course, that's very difficult to obtain because these are the least engaged students and the hardest to reach. But the main reason that we can't be sure quite what's going on here is we don't have any data about the use of support services. So for students who received the email or students who received the phone call, we don't know whether they went on to use support services. So we can't be sure if the support services aren't appropriate or students weren't using the support services. And we don't know whether more people from the email intervention went on to use support services or not. All sorts of reasons why we can't conclude necessarily that the phone call itself isn't an important intervention. There are a few challenges whilst running through this trial, and we'll come on to these in the panel discussion. One was data availability, and I've just talked about that now in terms of not knowing the tracking data for the students about whether or not they use support services. But there are also hidden manual processes that prove challenging in this, in that for when the learner analytics systems are not set up to provide different interventions to different students. And so there was a manual process where the student data of the students who had been flagged for interventions had to be downloaded and then manually coded to deliver either one intervention or another. And that was always an area which could lead to mistakes. And finally, reaching the non-engaging students to find out more about them, the really sort of difficult to reach students. And reaching those is always going to be very, very difficult indeed. But doing so will enable us to work out more about what either they or the institution needs to do in order to support those students. This project couldn't have happened without a large team of people, and I'd like to acknowledge everyone here, our evaluators from the Behavioural Insights team, and the personnel at Nottingham Trent and Sheffield Hallam, and also my colleague Eliza at Tazo, who helped me manage this project. So I'm going to hand over now to Ed and Helen for a panel discussion. I'm just going to put up a slide here Ed has provided, and he'll talk us through the context of the Nottingham Trent trial, and then I'll pass on to Helen to do similar.
Okay. Hi everybody, thanks Rob. Hopefully you can hear me and someone will start waving or shouting if not. So the context for NTU is we've been doing learning analytics for a while. We first implemented it in 2013-14, and I think like lots of people are using the Solution Path Stream tool. I think, as Rob indicated in the opening earlier in this presentation, what we were very happy with was that learning analytics could satisfactorily identify students at risk of non-progression or potentially underachieving in terms of their academic outcomes. So we were very clear that we could see data from very early in the academic year. And of course, when we present on this, we show the data that shows the full year's worth of information. There's a very stark difference between students with the highest and lowest engagement, but we can also see patterns from the very beginning of the term, of the academic year, sorry, rather. The challenges, though, are that changing patterns and trajectories of student behaviour. So previously, we've shared data with students, and what we think we can see is that those students who are already engaging well use learning analytics to sustain that behaviour, but it's less effective at changing students' behaviour with lower engagement, even though we have examples from qualitative work that show that. And we also provided data to the personal tutors, asking them to make interventions as and when the alert, or when the no engagement alerts popped up. And there are some real issues there around staff time to intervene and also staff time to record the intervention, so it's difficult to test the quality of the impact there. So during COVID-19, we ran a series of trials where we contacted students who disengaged, and we had qualitative information. Going completely off memory now, Rob. We had qualitative information around. Sorry, we didn't have qualitative at all. What we then did is we tested the impact of the call, and what we did is we tested the difference between students that we'd rung and spoken to and students that we'd attempted to ring and hadn't got through to. And there was a quite clear distinction between the two groups of students. If we can get through and speak to a student, we can see a change in their outcomes. And so for those reasons, we were interested in taking part in the TASO trial.
Sorry for removing the slide from under your notes. Okay, okay, Helen.
Thanks, Rob. So this project came at a really good time for us. We were just introducing a new team. So it gave us the opportunity to really shape that team and our offer, and also to enhance our service model. We were also able, as part of the project, to develop a theory of change for what, for us and for, I assume, many people, is a really complex area of work. So we were able to really think through what we wanted to achieve with our learning analytics. And I think we discovered along the way that lots of different institutions have lots of different drivers. So we were really able to define what our drivers were and how we wanted to achieve them. We did have some challenges along the way. Ethics was a huge challenge for us, perhaps a little bit unexpectedly. So we had to work really closely with our head of ethics at Sheffield Hallam to make sure that there was an understanding of what learning analytics was, what we wanted to achieve through the project, and we did make some amendments to how we communicated what we were doing to students in order to meet our ethical responsibilities as a university. Also a challenge was our how we use our data. So we do have some manual processes in place, and that did mean that for some of our impact measures, we did need to manually go into systems and retrieve certain bits of data. And that was quite time consuming and did require a lot of staff time in order to do that. And I think that's fed through into our next steps about how we manage that in future. Limitations. I think Rob's already alluded to the duration of the trial. It was very, very short. Some of our impact measures were beyond the scope of the trial, and we have continued to look at this set of data, and we've continued to monitor and analyze that data. Rob's also mentioned limited feedback from students who didn't engage. This is a group of our most disengaged students, and then inviting them to take part in research was really, really difficult. And we did have very limited response to that. We worked really hard. We did manage to speak to some students, and that was brilliant, but we would have liked much more data from our disengaged students. And that's just an ongoing challenge with research in general. Next steps, these are already well underway. We have revised our theory of change, so we've looked really closely at what our outcome measures are. We are continuing to monitor this this group of students that are involved in the trials, and we're developing our evaluation and impact measures as we go along. So we are kind of continuing with things, and our team that was newly established is now very well established, and they routinely offer interventions to our students. That's going really, really well.
Thank you, Helen. I think I might actually start with the theory of change. I think most people know now that TASO puts great importance on a theory of change to understand what outcomes an intervention is intended to deliver. And so, of course, both yourselves, Helen, and NTU had a theory of change for their learner analytics intervention, and you're talking about revising it. Are there any specific outcomes that you've added or removed as a result of that, or is it just more about processes that you're thinking?
Sorry, I was bringing up my theory of change in the background so I could answer that question properly.
Sorry, I've kind of sprung that on you a little bit.
Thanks for that. So yeah, a couple of the outputs that we had in our original theory of change, we have removed or reconsidered. So some of the more qualitative measures we have taken out because they are really difficult, as we've just spoken about, to go out and ask students to engage in that qualitative research. So where we have things like confidence in and awareness of our services, we've taken those out of our more of our theory of change going forward, so that we don't we're not required to go and speak to students in order to assess whether we've achieved that. That doesn't mean to say that we don't routinely speak to students. And one of the things that we did throughout the trial was speak to students and pick up anecdotal evidence through the telephone conversations that we were having with them. And that is really, really valuable to us. But we have just taken those things out of the theory of change. Another thing that we've taken out is reduction in students going through SHARP. Because actually sometimes that's a real benefit. So SHARP is the Sheffield Hallam at risk pathway, and actually if they're going through that, that is for their benefit. So yeah, those things we've taken out, and we did add a couple of things in, but unhelpfully I didn't highlight them, so I don't know what they are. But yeah, our new theory of change is what we're working with now.
Thanks, Helen. Sorry for putting you on the spot. So you've talked about the challenges you've faced in being involved in the evaluation. Is there any advice you would give to other providers who would be wanting to evaluate their learner analytics systems and interventions prompted by that? And can I start with you, Ed?
Yeah. I think the number one message is it's a hell of a lot messier than it might at first appear to be. So although this has been an RCT, I think for us there's been lots of issues around the boundaries between the two being very blurred. So to some extent, that challenge of effectively taking away a service has been a real kind of challenge for us in terms of making an effective study, if you like, because clearly we had a service in place and we were very uncomfortable about saying we will just stop doing one activity for a group of students. So hence the environment where we've ended up with an email intervention and an email plus a phone call intervention. And we thought that was a good compromise. And I wonder now with hindsight if actually we've made that an unnecessarily complex task. But that there's that to it. So the thought that struck me around that was almost do your randomized control trials really early in your cycle, that from day one, if you're experimenting with a new piece of kit, do it then, because you've got a cleaner run and you're not taking anything away. I think in a perfect world with perfect resource and perfect kind of backup, of course we'd do things differently. So I guess that's a second or third message, isn't it? That in reality, it's a more complex piece of work sitting on top of what you're already doing. And so perhaps be quite realistic about what you can achieve and then almost halve your outcomes or halve your expectations at that point.
I can't remember if it's been pointed out, but I think you will attend to you also had another good compromise in that students on the email only intervention who generated a second at-risk alert were automatically phone called.
And that, I think again it became as quite a messy boundary, and I think again that was the right judgment call because we didn't want to leave students hanging in the air. But again, you'll notice in one of the feedback comments, for example, from one of our students, it says intervention, the email only intervention, the student comments on the tone of voice from the phone call. And I don't think that everything's been mislabeled. I think that's genuinely that was a student on the email only route who generated a second alert. And at that point, the phone call took place and the conversation took place with the caller. So I don't know that it's big enough to mess up the kind of findings as such, but it was just another one of those. It's not as clean as it might appear to be when we're kind of unpicking this work.
Yes, but I agree. I mean, if a student's not engaging for maybe 28 days, you want to know how they're getting on. You can't just leave them hanging, I guess.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And obviously tied into all of this is work at scale, and I'm very aware that what we're looking at is largely outcome in terms of changes to engagement. And one of the complications in all of this is there will be students whose engagement bobs up and down because of things like sickness or processes that we might not be aware of, including repeating or short-term placements, where it sometimes can be quite difficult to see that data. And so fishing through that combination of students plus students who are genuinely struggling and genuinely disengaging becomes quite difficult. And it's the nature of the beast. There's not a lot we can do around that. But it creates some quite interesting issues in terms of just what's the intervention when we line down into it. What's the intervention that we're actually doing there with the students, and different things will be needed in different contexts. But it's part of the nature of the beast, I think.
Yes, I think that did reveal is the amount of probably extra data infrastructure you sort of need in order to properly evaluate the success of whatever intervention you're delivering. So you do need to know if a student's on a leave of absence or on the placement, or if they've been flagged up with a tutor before, etc., and what support services they're going on to, in order to be to properly conclude what the best form of intervention is in these cases, or whether or not they're working.
Yeah, and I think we're pretty good on data within the institution, and yet we have lots of systems where essentially there is a local level, there is a local level of knowledge that's not necessarily replicated or put into institutional systems, because of course, on one level, there's never been a need to, but there is also this ongoing process, and a colleague of mine, Emma, who's cited in the report, is heavily involved in work around how do we integrate better the multiple different data sources that we've got so that we get a better or a more complete picture that we can then, not only the calling team or the contact team, but also things like personal tutors or colleagues working in student support services can access. So yes, that may not be the most, it's not important from just an evaluation perspective, it's important from an actual operational point of view as well.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, Helen, are there any recommendations or advice you would give to others who are wanting to undertake an evaluation of their learning analytics system?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about being really, really clear about what your drivers are and making sure that everyone at the institution is on board with what your drivers are. And you might be surprised to find that people have different understandings. So for us, it's very clearly about student engagement. And I think we're all really clear as a university now because we've very clearly articulated and communicated that. But yeah, being really clear will help you to design what your impact measures are.
One thing that I think would be interesting to talk about is the importance of who makes the phone call. And because I know that I know previously at Nottingham it was the personal tutor, but it was changed to a calling service. Do you think it's important that it isn't a personal tutor and it's a dedicated and trained calling team?
I think it's very easy to be rude about personal tutors, and I don't wish to be. I think that academics have a very tough job, and one of the areas in which it's really tough is the diversity of the role. And I think that one of the issues that we've got is if you're a personal tutor and you are making an intervention with a student, if the first time you try and communicate to them, they respond, great. But if they don't respond the first time, your to-do list starts to get longer and longer and longer. And I don't think that there are many academics in a role where they can naturally switch into a customer-centric customer service role. I think there's too many other priorities and responsibilities. So I would never say that personal tutors can't do this, and I would never say that they're not the right people to do it. But I think there are genuinely barriers to most tutors being able to be very effective at this, just because it's a systematic process potentially when we start to get to large numbers. So I think personally the significant advantages for a calling team doing this, I think there's an opportunity to systematize this, and that's really, really important given the numbers. You know, we're talking about thousands of students here, and that means our variability is less. You know, that we know that the calls will be made. We know that they'll be made in a timely fashion. We know that there'll be a prioritization based on, you know, when the calls came in rather than kind of when somebody's has the time to make the calls. We know that that will happen. I would argue very strongly that from the contact team perspective, what we have is good training in things like coaching and listening and customer service type approaches, or putting the caller at the center of it. And again, the best tutors do that naturally, and the best tutors are brilliant at it. However, it's not necessarily something that everyone's skilled in. And if you're just shifting between a lecture and a seminar and a report you've got to write and making a phone call, you're not necessarily your head's not necessarily in the right place. We do have feedback from students that say they would like to talk to a tutor, someone from their course. Of course we do, and that comes out in some of the feedback. But for the most part, what we actually find is that students like the fact that there is a neutral person sitting outside of their course who has no power over them, who that the student can be quite open and honest with. And, you know, they can sometimes ask quite embarrassing questions around, I'm not sure how to go and ask this person for help because I don't want to look stupid, or I don't want to look like I don't know what's going on. Clearly everybody else gets it. So, you know, I think it plays a really important role from that perspective of everyone's favorite imposter syndrome. So I think it can, of course, it can be done by a number of different people. I would argue, though, that given the scale of our institutions, it really helps to focus it into a contact team. And, you know, our goal here, you know, we chose phone calls because it's about pricking students' consciousness. And we know this generation is not necessarily great on picking up the phone. And that's clearly one of our learning points is how do we improve that? But there's something there about just being able to press go and go and go and trying to get through to as many students as possible is my long answer to a very short question.
No, thanks, Ed. That's really useful. And as someone who's a personal tutor myself, I wouldn't have wanted to phone lots of students, although of course I did want to talk to them as well when they had problems, but maybe that would be as a postscript to having first been called by someone. And yeah, Helen, do you? Oh, sorry, yeah.
I think I think this is the nub of this particular study, is that if you look at how people describe student retention and studies and student support, everything hinges on a student being in contact with the institution in some way, or a person connected to the institution, or a family friend helping them make that connection. And what we're really talking about here is the gnarliest part of that problem. Once a student's in the system, once they're talking to a tutor or student support services, they're probably going to be okay. It's that this is that first port of call. And I know you and I have talked about email versus phone, etc. But there's something here about the heavy lifting needed to break into a student's consciousness in a way that they cannot just go, whatever, or it's another one of the 17 emails that I've got to deal with today. So I do think there's something, we're all looking for the golden bullet of the thing that pricks students' consciousness. And I do think there's something here that's worth continuing down the road of. Sorry, Helen, it's really good stuff.
Like a golden bullet, one step up from a silver bullet that we thought. Yeah,
we're aiming for the stars.
absolutely. Yeah, Helen, do you have any reflections on the use of a calling team?
Yeah, so our calls are delivered by our student success and engagement team, headed up by Katie Smalin, who was involved in this project, and I think she's here today. So a similar answer to Ed, really. They are delivered by our central team. They are really skilled and experienced at delivering these interventions. By using the central team, we are able to deliver that equitable, structured response, so we can refer them through those referral routes. So we know that all students are getting kind of the kind of a fair level of support. What happens routinely for us is our academic advisors, which is personal tutors, we call them academic advisors, are copied into communications, and that's really well received by our academic advisors. So they are aware if our student success and engagement team have contacted their students, and they can choose to do with that information what they want to. And we find that quite a few of them will follow up with students as well. So they're getting the formal response from the student success and engagement team, and then perhaps a follow-up from their academic advisor where they think that they need to do that.
Thank you. So students who are flagged for needing these support interventions, they're often expected to make changes to their behaviour rather than institutions making changes to their behaviour in order to support the students. So has the evaluation of this sort of changed your thoughts about the kind of interventions or the kind of support you need to deliver to students who are flagged as having low or no engagement? I don't know if you'd want to start with that.
Helen, do you want to go?
Yeah. So I think we really respond to students' feedback as well. So we have been able to kind of change our systems and processes in response to some of the things that we found from students. So as an example, one of the things that we've done is where there was a particular engagement problem with a particular group, we discovered that actually it was a commuter group of students and that they were struggling to come on campus, but there was resistance from that course to delivering online lectures and seminars, but actually they were able to change that behaviour to include our students as well. So it's our commuter students. So yeah, being responsive to what students are telling us, as well as expecting them to change their behaviours where necessary, I think is really, really important.
Yes, I think that's really interesting what you say about commuter students, because I think certainly one of the things, as I said in the introduction, that learner analytics definitely there is strong evidence for. It's identifying, allowing you to identify subgroups of students or that might be struggling, and also whether that coincides with changes made to teaching and learning and assessments and that kind of thing, so you can understand where there might be difficulties and where changes might need to be made. And conversely, when you do make a change, you can see if it has the appropriate effect on student engagement that you're expecting. Yeah, Ed, do you want to sort of
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's self-evidently true that we do expect students to change to meet us along, you know, to come to us, if in effect. And clearly, I think all institutions are at times guilty of not responding in that way, or not responding to meet students a little bit more where they are. And I'm very aware, for example, at the moment, there seems to be very important and heated discussion around the difference between mattering and belonging, for example. And the two are obviously incredibly related, but they are a little bit different in outlook. Yeah, I think that we feed back into on quite a local level. So the contact team do feed back to particular tutors where there are issues that seem to be cropping up around student behaviours, or around common complaints that come out from students. My team are no doubt shouting on the screen at this point. I can't think of an example of where we've been really good at large-scale institutional change as a consequence of the data that's coming back. I think there's lots of important learning points around in terms of professional development from the perspective of why students are calling us and why they've got issues that we'll feed into, or hopefully, our annual learning and teaching conference this year, to really pick up, you know, what students are telling us about issues that are causing and creating barriers for them to participate. So we do lots of reporting into the institution, but I don't know that we've been smart enough around building up kind of change processes within the institution.
Thank you. So things that I was also going to talk about in the panel are coming up in some of the questions. So I think I will add one of these in.
Okay.
So there wasn't a peer control group in this in either of the trials here. I think given the fact that you had an established intervention strategy, that would have been quite a difficult thing to have a peer control group. But there are certainly ways in which you could perhaps advance the intervention for some random group of students, just to see if perhaps the delay to, you know, currently it's 10 or 14 days, as a way of getting a pseudo control group, albeit temporarily. Is that something that you could consider, or is that something that's likely to result in such a large number of students being flagged that it would be difficult to, meaning, you know, it would actually be quite a difficult thing to test?
I'll jump in. We've looked at making some changes to our processes already as a consequence of taking part in this. So we've done some work around testing the impact of text messages in the second term of last year. So we've not analysed that data yet. That's one of the next pieces of work to do. Another change that we've made is around early. We've added in an extra early notification to students. So it's email based. It's a nudge in activity. This year we've run it in a very vanilla fashion. So we've just dropped in. This is the same message that we'll send to all students for the first 7 days after no activity, just to see if it makes a difference. I think for me, I'm interested in trialing things like A/B testing that early intervention. So what would happen if we tried and just keeping the vanilla email as it stands at the moment versus, and we've just seen a really interesting example from Keele where they send a link to a form. So what would happen if there was a more active assumption attached to that early email? So I think we're likely to try more A/B testing than necessarily RCTs. Not that I'd ever rule out randomized control trials, but it's quite a lot of work.
Yeah, it would be very much more helpful if the learner analytics systems themselves could do the work themselves, really, in terms of the randomization and interventions, and it's certainly something that TASO are calling for.
Yeah.
Helen, do you have any sort of reflections on this and the point of view of a control group? Because I know that when we were running the trial, it was to a small number of courses in your institution because you were rolling out learner analytics. Is it rolled out to sort of the rest of the institution or larger numbers now, or are you still
No.
sort of
I think it's fair to say that there was a fair bit of resistance to taking anything away from students. So we went with delivering business as usual to all students. So our business as usual offer is that all students who are flagged as red are given an email intervention, which was kind of our control group. And the enhanced intervention was given to that small group that you mentioned, Rob. We haven't gone out across the institution yet, and I think that is a capacity issue, maybe. But we've got a target group of around 15,000 students now, and that's our home undergrad students.
it must be quite a task. So rolling out from 1,500 to 15,000, I guess. Okay, and I think I've talked about all I'd like to talk about in the panel, but if either Helen or Ed wants to bring up anything else before I go out to audience questions, then I'm happy to hear from them.
Yeah, I think for us, the qualitative data was so important, and I think the stats, the quantitative data showed that there was no significant difference, but we've talked about belonging and mattering, and our qualitative data really showed that for us, that when we proactively telephone our students and start to build that relationship with them, they really valued it, and it really helped them to re-engage with their learning. So I think we shouldn't, I think there's definitely a place for this kind of trial, because we do need to know what works, and having that comparable data really helps us to understand that, but we need to balance that against the qualitative data as well.
I think I'd echo that point, that I think there's something here that's we saw very high perceptions of value from our students in terms of feeling that they mattered and that someone had reached out to them. And in our work prior to this as well, we tend to see that we've contacted vulnerable students in a way that I think it's really stood out, and that for whatever reasons about self-confidence, younger people are not necessarily coming forwards to seek out help. So it feels like there's an element here that's really important in terms of listening to what they're telling us. I'm bound to say I slightly disagree with the no difference whatsoever. And I get the no statistical significant difference, but I'm looking at that figure 3 and I'm thinking that's 3%, mate. But I get that I'm not the statistician in the room. I would say that I think there is a difference between the email only and the call intervention, in that if we look at the things like how students responded, I know that more students picked up the call when they booked the appointment, but the reality is that about 3% of students in that group responded in some way to us, and about 44% students who we rang responded. So there's a very big difference there in terms of how students behaved as a consequence of those two interventions. And of course, I accept completely that the long-term impact or the measures of subsequent engagement, with the possible exception of additional risk flags. But apart from that, I accept the point here. So for me, there's something quite important around, it's not that the approach is necessarily broken, it's that we need to learn better about what to do. And I think you've written that nicely in the conclusion of your report, Rob, but I think for me, there's some quite important issues around, is the reason that we're not seeing a difference because the model itself is broken? And I don't believe that's the case. I think there are changes we can make elsewhere, but I think there's something important that it seems unlikely we're ever going to be in a place where we don't need to intervene around students who are struggling to cope, who capacity building approaches haven't made a difference for. So for me, there's work around how do we improve the response rate? So if we had more students picking up, would we see a statistically significant difference? I believe that our training and our support for the callers is good, and their learning is good in terms of the way that they learn from one another. So there will always be room for improvement there, but I think that's okay. And then we have issues around, could we intervene earlier, with some real issues around capacity there. But I think that if we wanted to see a difference, could intervening a couple of days earlier make much impact there, or even trying slightly different approaches in terms of, for example, if we can make time for it, follow-on calls a week later. So there's areas of work here that are not. I think there is a difference between calling and emailing, even if the long-term outcome or the outcomes measured here isn't showing much difference there. But I think there are challenges around how we improve the processes that we have, rather than necessarily the processes themselves are just not worth considering.
I think if I could just add one more thing, Rob, as well. We did talk earlier about the length of this trial and about that being a limitation. And we know already from our continued observation of this group that we've had less withdrawals at assessment boards. I don't know whether that's statistically significant yet, but for us, that's a really positive thing. So as I say, we are doing that analysis, and I guess we'll see if it's significant or not, but we know that we are seeing some improvements.
Yes, I suppose. I mean, one of the reasons that we might not have found statistically significant differences here that we haven't touched upon is that maybe the outcome measures that we tested aren't the outcomes that actually the intervention seeks to change. So we think it's re-engaging with learning, and we'll measure that through learner analytics data, but perhaps it's well-being, and their well-being will have improved, even if they're not necessarily still turning up, because they're not turning up for other reasons, due to finances, or having to work part-time jobs, or all sorts of other things, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I don't think I said this, but the other thing to say as well in all of this discussion is, it's not a clean environment, in that quite a lot of what's going on is there are other interventions taking place across the institution. So it's not that we've been able to turn everybody off from supporting students. And so that also adds to I think the messiness of this particular piece of work as well, just to really add complexity on complexity.
Yes, it's these testing these kind of interventions is not clean, is it? It's difficult data, and learner analytics is probably the most amenable to randomized control trials, and even that is a very difficult, still messy and difficult.
Yes, yeah, and I think as well, it's sometimes can fool us into thinking that we've got an objective reality, and of course what we've got is some data points, and in our instance, and I think in Sheffield Hallam's instance, there's a pretty strong correlation, or there's a very strong correlation between amount of activity that you do or the absence of activity and success. But of course, what we're not drilling down to is that kind of the inner person. Yeah. We're seeing proxies for engagement rather than actual engagement, if you like. So, it's even though it looks like it should be the best scientific data that we've got, there are some limitations to it as well.
Okay, I'm going to move on to audience Q&A now. So I've got a question from Louise, part of which has been answered already. But one of them was, which email addresses were used to contact the students? Was it their university email addresses or their personal email?
Yeah. Whilst Ed's having a cough, we used university email addresses, and we communicate really clearly to our students when they join us that is our primary method of a communication, through the university email address. That's why we went with that. So we just used those.
We also used the dreaded university email address. So alongside reminders and offers and all the other things that students get in their email, this was the route that we used, yeah. Because ethically it felt appropriate to use it and not to be contacting students on their personal address.
Sure. There's a question from Anthony. I suspect it'll be one, as I'm sort of on top of the methods, a little bit more in terms of the impact analysis that I'll be answering. It's, how does engagement post-email or phone call compare to that of students who didn't receive the email or phone call, but exhibited a similar level of disengagement? It's not clear if a comparison of that kind was made, and if not, what were the control groups in the RCT design? Well, no, that comparison wasn't made. It perhaps could have been, but it'd be difficult to do so because they are students who didn't receive any intervention at all. And because particularly for, admittedly for NTU, where you've got low, it's a strict no engagement alert, it would probably be interesting to look at those students who just miss off triggering a no engagement alert and looking at that. That's sure. But also that there was no peer control group as well in this design. It was comparing strictly email versus email plus phone call.
Sorry.
No. What's the okay? Were the outcomes data split by year of study or department at all? And if so, were there any differences? Yes, in the regression analyses, we had year of study and department as covariates. Off the top of my head, I can't remember if there were any differences, but they are available in the impact reports. Okay, there's one for Ed here. For NTU, the previous evaluation that found that students did best with a phone call, was this in comparison to an email alone, or was this a different setup and not an RCT? And why do you think this finding was different?
No, it's the same process. So all students who'd met the criteria of a no engagement alert, we attempted to contact them. So they'll have had the same process of an email followed by an attempted phone call. And so what we were looking at was the difference between students who answered the phone and those who didn't. And so it's essentially it's looking at so it's within, it's not one was an RCT and one was not. Sorry, one was a control, one was an RCT. It was all within the group. So I think the reason that we saw a different response or difference there is most likely because, of course, some students will pick up the phone for reasons including that they may be ready to pick up the phone, whereas some of the students that weren't ready to pick up the phone or weren't in a place where they felt confident to do so. So we were probably seeing patterns of behaviour associated with students in a place where they were prepared to or ready to re-engage, which is pretty much what we see from most kind of academic interventions, I would argue. That difference between where the student is the thing that makes the difference, which is a damn shame to be able to claim it forever.
Okay, so this is a question that will be for both of you about the process of consent for both the student for the students on the trial. So could you clarify which students you asked for consent and perhaps be more specific about the consent you asked? Helen, would you like to talk through that first?
Yeah, this is a challenge. And this was one of the main sticking points for our ethics submission, actually. So we originally said that as part of our student privacy notice, students sign up, they consent for us to use their data for learning analytics purposes. So on induction, they sign up to that. They know that we're using their data for learning analytics. And part of that is for enhancing our offer, research purposes. And we felt quite confident with that. We had consulted with students on that. We'd also consulted with our head of data protection. That is not her job title, but she's our GDPR expert. So we were very, very confident that we'd covered ourselves through our student privacy notice, but our ethics department did have a different opinion, and that's fine. That's why we go through ethics. It's about making everything as robust as possible. So what they wanted us to do was make sure that all of our students had the opportunity to withdraw, and that's kind of part of them consenting to be part of the research project. And our solution was not ideal, if I'm honest. So our solution was to create a participant information sheet which outlined what the project was, why we were doing it, everything you might find in a normal participant information sheet, and post it onto our Blackboard or course, our Blackboard module sites for the students who were involved in the trial. We did know exactly which modules that we were which modules and which courses we were targeting, because they were obviously our target population. So we were able to do that very, very easily. One of the issues with that, this was suggested by our ethics team, so obviously absolutely above board, but one of the challenges is that we know that those students weren't engaging with their Blackboard sites, and that's why they had been flagged as red. So the students who probably most needed to read those participant information sheets perhaps didn't. And that is a little bit of an ethical dilemma, and I think it's a little bit of an ethical grey area for me. But that was the best solution that we could find to fully inform our students about the project. So we went with it, and we didn't have any challenges from students. They knew at the point that we contacted them that this was part of a project, etc. So I'm confident that we did everything ethically. We didn't gather consent for the particular project, but we do gather students' consent for us to use their data in this way through the student privacy notice.
Thanks, Helen.
Broadly the same. So it's part of students' privacy notice, and we sought ethical approval for this process. And perhaps because we've been doing it for a bit longer, there weren't any issues that particularly came up around our protocols.
And I think that's really important, Ed. Part of it is about communicating with the wider staff body about what we do and why we do it and how we do it, and just raising that awareness of what learning analytics is. And I think we achieved that through participation in this project. We did have really good conversations with our ethics team so that we are making sure that we're behaving ethically and they know why and what we're doing. So yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Okay. So we've got a question here from Louise. I know you mentioned demographics can be linked. I can't remember whether you said it was included in the trial or not, but especially for Ed, have you seen any difference between groups if you've been using it, and specifically widening participation characteristics?
You're going to have to forgive me, I'm a bit behind. Historically, when we've looked at differences in engagement, looked at engagement, we have seen differences between demographic groups. Our more recent work is actually quite a lot more nuanced, and some of the work that Eleanor, who was involved in this report, has done shows that for some groups there's very, very little difference, if any at all. So some of the differences in outcomes aren't necessarily because students are engaged less. There's perhaps other factors going on there, but we've not sat down and gone through every single one of the different demographic groups and said, okay, what's the story here, or what's our analysis of this yet? So I suspect there will still be some groups. In fact, and I know of one group where there are still differences, but I think it's a more nuanced picture than it has been when we looked at it in the past. So I'm afraid that might be a slightly watch this space observation or response.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to restate that this is very much about student behaviour, and that's an important thing to look at when you're working out where you should target interventions, because if you start taking demographic factors into account, you're starting to make assumptions about people, and I think it's important not to do that.
Yeah, and I think as an institution, we're thinking about approaches like looking at engagement within demographic groups, if you like, to try and deal with that, try not to stereotype students, but thinking if we've got historical areas where there's poorer rates of progression, are the things we should be paying more attention to within groups. So trying to be a bit more nuanced about how we deal with that and how we share data in a meaningful fashion.
Thanks, Ed. Okay. Got a question here. Is the goal to improve engagement and ultimately retention of students, and therefore are fewer students leaving their course in the first year as a result of the interventions?
I think for us, yes. But I think that's what I was saying earlier about really clearly identifying what your drivers are for using analytics at your own university are, and they will be different for some institutions. Yeah.
Yeah, there's such a strong correlation between engagement and outcome that you would want to try and boost engagement, even if it's not perfect, even if there are other barriers in the way. Absolutely. That's the destination, that's the goal. Yeah, Yeah, and it should be that at the end of the day, if doing more activity associated with your course isn't a good thing, then there's a problem there with how you've designed your learning and teaching, I would argue, which is an argument nobody asked for, but I sort of mention it anyway.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here from Ian Bretherton. How were the interventions recorded to allow for subsequent data analysis? I'm not sure. We might need a little bit more information there, but my assumption is very much that we knew which group they were in, whether they received an email or not, or whether they received an email and whether they received a phone call and whether they answered it. And that was the extent of the recording of the intervention, I think, from the point of view of a quantitative analysis anyway.
Yeah, good old Excel for us.
Yes, again, this is something that I'd argue to streamline all this approach, but people will be tired of me banging on about that soon, so I'll maybe stop doing that. There's one here. I noticed at Sheffield Hallam, approximately a third of the students in the selected group raised an alert, and this seems like a high proportion. Does this reflect how the initial 1,500 students were chosen? And before I hand over to Helen, I will just reiterate that recall that at Sheffield, students who had engagement could still be flagged for an intervention, whereas at Nottingham, students only were flagged if they had zero engagement over a period of time. So that will be part of the reason why there is this difference between the two. But sorry, Helen.
That's okay. So Carolyn Fern, who kind of jointly led the project, would have been able to give you a lot more information on our recipes, as she calls them, not the technical term. So it's not what that is not why those students were chosen. Those groups were chosen because they were some of our biggest courses. Our recipes, I'm not going to use technical terms, were kind of very much being developed at that stage, and we have now refined them. So I mentioned earlier we've got a population of 15,000 for our current work, and I'm told by Katie, thank you very much, Katie, that we're contacting about 15% of those. So that number is reduced through refining the recipes that we use for flagging our students. So yeah, I think that's it. We've enhanced the kind of the way that we define which students should be flagged. That has reduced the number of students that are identified as at risk. And yeah, current rate's about 15%.
Thanks, Helen. Okay. Would you ever consider text messaging, or have you other interventions? And if so, did you receive a better, I guess, better student responses? I think one thing that I didn't cover in the impact analysis, and I think is worth noting, that Sheffield had a slightly higher call success rate, or a fairly much higher call success rate than NTU. And the main difference between the two trials was that Sheffield sent a text message to warn students they were going to receive a phone call. So that might be why the difference was. I think Sheffield was around the 60% mark off the top of my head. Yeah, that's worth bearing in mind. But yes, I'll now pass on to Ed and Helen to answer that question.
I think we've got slightly contradictory information on this. So the reason that we built in that text message into part of our intervention was because we'd previously done a study a few years back where we'd found that if we do send that text message, then we've got a much better chance of students picking up the phone. And so we built that into our trial, and that was kind of part of what we really wanted to explore. We only really had anecdotal evidence. We got a sense and a feeling that sending that text message was going to increase that call pickup rate. So we did it, and actually think that we found that it reduced the number of students who picked up the phone. And so we have now dropped that. So our student success and engagement team now cold call, and the pickup rate, I'm told, is much better without sending the text first. We haven't done a proper trial on that, but I think, you know, it's kind of, that's the sense that the team get, is that actually they're going to get a much better response rate from cold calling rather than sending that text message first.
I think we found the same. So we tried this in term 2 after the this particular study, and my understanding is that the response rate went down. Now, I think there's something around, we at least want to experiment with some different text messaging just to see if actually what we did is too vague, too frightening, whatever it might be. But I think it wasn't the panacea that we kind of hoped it would be, if I'm really honest. So I think definitely something to expend more time, a little bit more time looking at.
Yeah, I agree. I think
Completely.
Needs a bit more investigation, but our tone was, well, we were aiming for friendly,
Yeah.
and supportive.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, and that has to be the tone that you adopt, because if you're contacting students out of the blue, you know, we've done the thought experiment around, could you take a sergeant major type approach of, you know, pull your socks up, buddy, you need to kind of get this message. But of course, if it's someone who is an absolutely terrible place, that's the last thing they need to hear. So you have to be, you know, we almost have to design the communication around worst possible case scenarios. So there are some issues that come with that in terms of, it's difficult to be urgent when someone might be in a really bad place. So it's tricky to get that right, I think.
Okay, thank you. Before I move on to the next question, I'm just going to quickly advertise our conference. We're hosting a 2-day residential conference in Nottingham on the 7th to 8th of May to help the HE sector learn about best practice approaches to evaluation. The conference will feature interactive sessions led by expert facilitators, and attendees can expect sessions catering to both beginner and advanced evaluators and ensuring relevance and engagement for all participants. The conference is ideal for practitioners, managers, heads of department involved in developing access and participation plans, and evaluators in higher education and third sector representatives interested in enhancing their understanding of best practice evaluation methods. And there'll be a link to more details about the conference in the post-event email. And I'm also going to put up a slide. We'd love your feedback on this event. So feel free while the remaining questions are being answered. Okay, so thanks for the, that was the quick advertising break. So now I've got a question for Ed. If the central team reach out to the academic personal tutors, is the student aware that their personal tutor has been alerted? And they're just thinking about this in terms of consistency of the student experience, if some personal tutors who reach out and others don't.
Okay, brain freeze. Yeah, yes, yeah. Sorry, I can't remember the exact email that students. Yeah, students are informed about it, but mostly what we're doing when we're contacting tutors at that point is not, we're not asking them to intervene at that point. What we're saying is, do you know a reason we shouldn't be getting in touch with the student? So it's quite important that, as I say, there might be something. There may be a reason. So if for example the tutor's been dealing with a student, and you know that they've got a position of trust, or they've got a relationship going, and then we ring them out of the blue, it's that it might be discombobulating for the student. So the purpose of the call isn't to prompt the tutor into intervening, it's to make sure that if we shouldn't be intervening, we're not doing so. So it's more about not overloading the students is the purpose behind the call. But I'm doubting my own sanity, but I am 99.99% confident that in the communication we use, we do mention that we're communicating with a tutor for that purpose. Obviously now, Jonathan, you can carry on laughing if you want to.
I know the question wasn't directed to us, but we do let our students know that the academic advisor has been contacted.
Yeah.
Very good. how do the panel feel about using dashboards or visualizations to help with engagement? And is that something you currently do or are currently considering? I suppose this sort of also ties in with the control group, giving students access to a dashboard of their own engagement. Is that a sufficient intervention almost? But anyway.
We have an app. I don't know whether that's what the question is asking actually, but we've got our students have access to an app. So they can view their own engagement, but we don't necessarily align that to other students on the module. I think we had quite a lot of debate about that. So whether they could see how they were performing against others, we don't do that.
Okay.
So they have an access to an app, they can see how they're engaging, and the call team do reference that when they call out to students, so they can have a discussion about the student's data, which the student can access through the app. Does that make sense?
So the students themselves can see their own engagement in our system, in the stream system, and they can also see the average engagement of everybody else on their course in their year. So we made the judgment call that that context was actually very important, because if we want students to be aware of or consider how to change or manage their own learning, they needed some kind of benchmark. I think I've said already at the start that what we tend to find is that it's a more effective tool for keeping students who are already engaged even more engaged, because they're kind of, it gives them that nice kind of positive reinforcing message. When we've done survey work with students, students who've got very low engagement often will tell us that they find it quite a stressful thing, because it's perhaps reinforces messages or doubts that they've got for themselves. So there's always a little bit of a tension there around, we're trying to treat students like adults, and we think that's appropriate to treat them like adults, but at the same time, we don't think that in itself it's necessarily enough support, and that actually what we need is interventions, as I say, originally from tutors and now from the contact team, that we think that that's important to be doing. And I'm not sure if the question was actually about a dashboard from the perspective of kind of someone sitting in the centre in a Dominic Cummings type war room going, more people over there or less people over there kind of thing. But I'm a little bit skeptical about management information, etc. I think what we need is more stuff, in essence, not necessarily more information, which is a little bit of the curse of higher education. Just in case I wasn't coming across as opinionated enough this afternoon.
Okay. So I've got linked questions here. What metrics do you find most effective for identifying at-risk students? I think they're asking about how they're sort of the relative weights of the different ones, and I wondered if you had any insight onto that.
So across the basket that we use for engagement, for measuring engagement, we put more weighting on VLE use, because there's a lot more of it. There's an indication that's stronger, if you like. Obviously, to some extent, the decision we've made, a little bit similar to Hallam, in that it's the absence of activity becomes the more important metric there. So I don't know. I'm sure we could find ways of going, there are individual elements or individual metrics that themselves of greater value, but it feels a little bit like, you know what, if a student has stopped doing something, that's an indication. And, if it maybe one day we'll absolutely crack this game, and then we'll move up to a slightly less serious kind of level of risk. But I think that for us, it's that absence of activity is the really crucial part.
So we only use VLE data and attendance data, so physical attendance, and the way that we build our recipes is department based, so we build that at department level. I don't think we've done any testing on which of those metrics is the most important. But yeah, I think we continually refine our recipes to make sure that we are flagging at-risk students. And I mentioned Carolyn earlier, she's got much more of an overview of how we build those recipes. She's kind of the operational person, so she would give you a much more detailed answer.
And I think I can concur with both of what you're saying from retroactive analysis of learner analytics data that I've done that found that attendance and VLE engagement were the two largest factors when you're doing a regression analysis against attainment. So yeah, which on the face of it isn't actually that surprising, I guess, because if they're not correlated, then we're probably doing something wrong. But there we go. Okay. So I've got an interesting question here. What protocol do you follow for those students who do not engage after the intervention?
Sorry, I'm conscious I'd go first quite a lot. Helen, do you want to go first?
Oh, you're on mute, Helen, sorry.
Oh, okay. I was saying that gives me thinking time, but that's fine.
Oh, sorry.
Protocols that we follow for students who don't engage after. We do have withdrawal for non-engagement policy that we put into place if students still aren't engaging. So that is a standard policy for all students who don't engage. But yeah, I guess after an intervention, that's what we put in place.
We have 2 cycles of intervention. So at present, we'll try once and then we'll try a second time, and then we'll pass the student up to their school. So we have a number of school contacts or contact in each of our academic schools who we say, look, we've tried this many times to get through to the student, and actually now we just want you to be aware, because potentially either they're not treating the call seriously enough, or they're not, you know, it's just not a sufficient weight, if you like. So at that point, we pass back up to the schools to say, look, I think you might want to investigate further or try and make contact yourselves.
Okay, thank you. So there are a couple of questions here that I think, well, there's one I can certainly answer. Thinking about outcomes, was there any analysis carried out at the module level to understand the relationship between attendance and module assessment results as a result of these interventions? Well, certainly not as part of this impact analysis. And then I think the final question, have you considered a more targeted approach towards some courses where withdrawals or withdrawals are higher or attainment is lower?
I don't think we have a student withdrawal as a student withdrawal, and if they're flagging up a lack of activity, it's a risk no matter where they are, if you like. So that might be, I don't know, that might be a lack of imagination on our part, but I think there's something that's important there around, you know, a student that goes is a student that goes, and actually we're trying to reach across to trying to get to as many students as possible if we can. So no, it's not something we've considered, although actually I can see the sense of it, because I suspect there's a slight contagion aspect to once students start to leave from a course, it probably makes it okay for other students to drop out as well. So I can see it could be a more serious issue, but no, we've tended to be quite straight down the line on those are the metrics that we use, and that's who we'll try and reach out to.
I think similar priority for us at the moment is providing that equitable support to all students. So we've not necessarily targeted that at particular groups. Okay, thank you. So thanks again to Ed and Helen for a really insightful discussion. We're after your feedback, as you can see on there. If you don't want to answer that now, just look out for it in the post-event email. Just a note about some upcoming events we've got at TASO. We've got evaluation support for tackling the ethnicity degree awarding gap, which is online on the 13th of March. There's an overnight writing residency, designing evaluation for access and participation plans on the 18th and 19th of March. And our annual conference, as you'll have seen and heard the advertising earlier, how to evaluate on the 7th and 8th of May. Thanks all for attending. And again, thank you, Ed and Helen, for coming along and sharing your thoughts today. Thanks, Rob.